Hello, and welcome to Good News Rhode Island. As you know, this is the show about Rhode Island and all the people and places and events that make us love Rhode Island, the place that has us all drawn to so many different activities and lectures, etc., and schools, etc., libraries, etc. Today, we are going to thank our team. First of all, I want to thank Emily Westcott, who has scheduled us for this semester, and I thank you, Emily, from the bottom of my heart. Also, I want to thank Vern Stromberg, our director, Jean Asaro, our graphic designer and editor, Bill Carpenter, our cameraman, Art Kubik, our cameraman and also timer, and Will Anderson, editor and cameraman. So thank you so much to all of you for being here and for being faithful. And of course, we can't forget Leanne Varner, our staff person. Thank you all. Today, we're going to start off with a dreamer, somebody who knows science and knows dreams and knows kids and knows adults. I want to welcome Padma Venkatraman, who is here with us today to talk about her books, but also her past life. And she has had many experiences in life that most of us have not. So I'm welcoming you here as someone who wants to learn. So thank you for coming. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
And Padma, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your childhood first, to show sort of where your context is for writing your books.
I grew up in India, so I was there till I was about 19. I was around 19 when I left. And it was, well, I was born into a very wealthy family, but when I was about 8, my parents separated. And so after that, I was definitely the poor cousin, and suddenly we lost the big house that I had with, or I felt that we had, with the polo ponies and all the rest of it, and suddenly we were in this tiny apartment, and it was just me and my mother, and she had to work from scratch to build everything up again. And so the second half of my childhood was definitely not wealthy at all, and that's something that I think figures significantly, especially in my latest book, The Bridge Home.
That must have been quite a learning experience for you.
It was, and I think the thing that it taught me most of all, that I think I perhaps would never have had if I had stayed in that sort of wealthy bubble, was the fact that I was able to interact with children who had much less than even I did. And so, even though we were under economic hardship, even though my mother had to work day and night to get food on the table and have the roof over our head, and it was a very difficult circumstance because I don't remember any other child through all of my years of school and college, because I finished college by the time I was 19 in India, and no other child that I knew had separated parents that were alive. So I was subjected to quite a bit of bullying from children and from adults because it was so different, and I think that was hard, but being able to meet, because my mother made sure that she volunteered in homeless shelters and places for kids who had much less than I had. And in India, there is still a level of poverty that just goes beyond anything I have ever seen in this country. And so I knew that I was not growing up in poverty. And luckily, I had a chance to meet and get to know some of these children from walks of life that was so different that I perhaps would never have met them, and become friendly with them and really call them my friends if it hadn't been for the fact that my parents separated. And their stories are what play into my book, The Bridge Home.
So it gave you an imagination, in a way, I would say a paved imagination. So it wasn't that you were imagining, it's that you knew and you could pave into those for your books. Very interesting. And then you made this leap to become a scientist. So maybe you could tell us something about that. So you went to college in India.
I did. And growing up in India, although my family would not be very happy if I said this, but it's true. I think women and men were treated differently. Girls and boys were treated differently. The expectations societally were different. And very young, I loved mathematics and I loved numbers just as much as I loved words. I still do. And I realized somewhere along the line that although I had never had any books that showed me women of color that were scientists, I still knew that through being a scientist, I could stand on my own 2 feet. And that was something I really always wanted. I always wanted financial independence. And that's
I can see why. It was part of your past, obviously.
Yeah, and so that's part of why I became a scientist.
So you went really interesting places. Tell us some of your work as a scientist.
I went to the Andaman Islands, which actually play into my novel, The Bridge Home. So, actually, not The Bridge Home, sorry. Island's End is a novel that actually draws on my experiences in the Andaman Islands. And I was there for about a year. I had the experience of cutting through rainforests that were not cutting through, walking through rainforests that nobody had ever walked through before.
Oh my.
And all that sort of thing.
And so you saw things that normally one wouldn't see on an island, I would assume.
Yeah.
And from that, you became director of a ship that was doing research, is that right?
Yes, so for a short while I went to Germany, and at that point I was the only female, the only person of color, the only person under 6 feet tall, the only non-native German speaker, and I was the boss of that vessel.
Wow, that would be hard in a new language, or had you had a lot of German?
No, I hadn't actually, so I picked it up on the job. And I think I ordered my men around quite well.
So all of us have this concern, this deep love, as though, yes, it is in a way our mother, this ocean that's around us, particularly in the ocean state. Talk to me just for a moment about the concerns of a scientist, a chemist, and what's happening in the ocean and what we can do. I mean, that's not a 2-minute question, I understand. But.
Yeah, I mean, I could speak about it for 20 days or 20 years and it wouldn't be enough. And I think part of it was that when I was a child, and I spoke about all of the experiences that made me write The Bridge Home. When all of that happened, I was also living in Chennai or Madras, which is really close to the ocean, and it was very clear to me that we were not treating the environment well at all. Some of the children that I had seen and got to know, and whose stories are in The Bridge Home, are actually children who worked on rubbish dumps, trying to salvage things, to recycle. So already I knew that we had so much waste. And to me, that was my entry into oceanography and into pollutant chemistry, was just the fact that even at that time I knew what was happening to our oceans. And to me it is shocking, surprising, and very disheartening that people confuse facts with feelings sometimes. And we have one planet that is inhabitable to the best of our knowledge. And the fact that we are doing our best right now to make it uninhabitable is a tragedy for the humanity as a whole.
And so what do you think can be done? I mean, how do we get to all the people in power, for example? Are they the people that can change things, or is it us who feel that we have no power? What can we do?
I think everything. Every time I speak to a group of people, and I do end up speaking about my books for the most part, but I think it's so very, very important to me that every child, every human being thinks about what they can do to change their own habits. And I think to me that's when we stop, and that's when we don't want to do anything. We love to point our fingers at someone else, and I always think when I point my finger at someone, there are 3 fingers pointing right back at me. And that to me is something important to understand, and to say, what can I do with those fingers that are pointing back at me? What can I change in my own life? And there are small steps that we can take, but I think we must take. If I don't use a plastic water bottle, and I take my water bottle with me everywhere, and I reuse it, and I reuse it, and I reuse it, and I reuse it, so I'm not buying, a new fancy one every time, until it can no longer be reused, I'm making a statement. Every time I drink out of, every time I go to a cafe and someone puts tea or coffee into a mug that is going to be disposed of in the next 2 minutes, and I say, no, may I have actual silverware or actual something? When I host something in my house, is it possible for me to just go that extra mile, and rather than having paper plates that I throw away or plastic, can I do something that is maybe more difficult for me? And I think it's those things that we have to do. We have to make those steps that make our lives a little more difficult, but then make less trash in the world, that make less, among other things, global climate change is obviously caused by our driving around, our flying around. Drive a little less. What can I do to make sure that that happens? If we start changing our own lives and start influencing the sphere that we have some control over, our friends, our families, if we start there, our students perhaps, if we're teachers, I think that starts to make a change. And absolutely, as much as we can, influence policy as well, and tell people that they can't go on doing what they're doing.
What was the major change that you saw while you were working? Did you see some major change? I mean, in my lifetime, I have seen major changes in the health of waters, say lakes or the ocean. Even the way you are kayaking and you look down and you could see the rocks and you could see the crayfish or whatever it is down low. Now you can't. Now you don't have shells coming onto the shore. Now you don't have seaweed so much coming onto the shore. I mean, there are huge changes that have occurred in my lifetime. What did you notice?
One of the big changes that I've noticed is, and I keep going back to the Bridge Home because it's my baby, it's my newest baby, but when I started, when I had the inspiration for that book, was one of the children that I had known growing up who had done work on those dumps. Well, when I was growing up, the city that I was growing up in, Madras, was unclean, but there was still a beach. You could actually go to the beach and there was sand on the beach. Well, now, recently, when I go and visit the same beaches, there is more plastic than there is sand. And that is not even an exaggeration.
And how did you deal with that in the Bridge Home? How did you bridge the difference in your careers as a chemist and then as a writer here in this book?
I don't know in this book that I really looked at that, the physical chemistry of anything. To me, obviously, there is that environmental angle in the book because you know what the children are doing and they're digging through these, they call them the Himalayas of rubbish, these mountains that are
that big?
They are that big, some of them. And I have photographs actually of them on my website. But anyway, to me, that was not immediately an issue, but there is another issue, and I think that's why I moved from science to writing, is, again, it's how you feel sometimes that makes a change. And I think facts are very important, but facts alone don't do enough. So facts and feeling have to work together. And to me, we have to understand that issue, that children are still today homeless and hungry on the streets of India, is something that impacts us and must impact us here today in Rhode Island. It's not an issue that someone else has to deal with that's so far away. It is our issue. All of these things are timely. The fact that we allow that to exist, we have to understand, we have to question, and we have to change how
our
we
moral
think.
integrity.
Yes.
In a way, we have to have global integrity, is what you're
Yes.
saying, not just our own street or
Yes.
whatever.
And begin with our own street, but keep that global picture in mind and in heart.
So you made this transition to writer, to author, to literary person because as a child you were told you had some kind of acuity for writing or for poetry, whatever, and I think your writing sounds like it's poetic. But then you made this transition because you realized you could influence kids more by doing this kind of thing than by being a scientist.
In a sense, and when you say influence, I want to be careful because I don't think that any author, in my opinion, has the right to preach. And we are not preachers. We don't try to shove ideas or shove messages down someone's throat. But to me, if a child, a young person, picks up a copy of The Bridge Home, they don't just open the book and enter a different place or a different time. Hopefully, they enter the heart and mind and soul of some other person. That character that then becomes alive. You inhabit that person's skin. And I think through that experience, you become more empathetic. How could you not? Your compassion increases. And to me, that's what a book does that is so magical and so immense. And I think that's the way that I see my books working, is just being that place that someone can get into somebody else's skin. And then I don't tell them what to think or what to do, if anything, but hopefully that experience changes
I used
them.
the wrong word, but I appreciate what you're saying because I remember reading, and even in class, I would just sit and read if I found a book that I loved, and I'd find out the teacher was staring down at me. But basically, the power of that word to create images in your mind and create a new life in your mind is very strong.
Yes.
And that's what you're hoping children will experience.
Yes. And the adults that read the books too. And I think I was just speaking to your staff a little bit earlier about the fact that sometimes adults think that young people's books aren't for them, and I just think young people's books are for everyone.
I have a quote here that says, "The library was my only blessing. Every time I climbed the stairs, my heart lifted. All day I look forward to the happy hours I spent in that beautiful room." That sounds like a lot of people, although sometimes it's in their own house with a book in their hand rather than in the library. But tell us about this character.
So that came from my novel Climbing the Stairs, and that was inspired by my mother's life. So my mother, as a young girl, grew up in a house in which she was forced to live downstairs where the kitchen was, and only men were encouraged to climb the stairs to get books out of the upstairs library. And so, I had this strong image of her at one point, which is the image that ended up being on the hardcover of the book, which was of a young girl standing at the foot of a staircase and wondering if she should climb it or not. And of course she did climb, and if she hadn't done that, I don't know if I'd be here speaking to you today.
And you must have climbed your father's library when you were living in that house that had...
When we were in the large house, we had we had so many books. And we had a little library with wooden stairs, which is quite unusual in India, and an entirely wood-paneled room filled with books, which I loved. And of course, after my parents separated, all of those books were no longer necessarily mine. That was difficult.
But did you find libraries then?
No, I did have a small library of books that I took back with me, and I reread and read and read all the time. And I think sometimes that can be a blessing, because when you read books that are really excellent, I think they sort of seep into you, and they become part of you. The rhythms of the language, maybe the music of the language becomes part of you.
Tell me about the character in this book. What has she done? And this has the editor's choice in book list. Every one of your books has awards on it. So
The Bridge Home is a global read aloud, and it doesn't have it just came out this year, so pray for me, and then hopefully it will have awards on it. But it just came out this year, so not
a read
not quite
aloud
yet.
is what?
A global read aloud is this wonderful thing. It's run by this person called Pernille Rip, and it's in fact in its 10th year, like your program. And she connects children around the world, and they come together through a book. And The Bridge Home is one of those books, and it's amazing. We are actually in the Global Read Aloud now, and it's amazing to me to have letters every day from teachers all around the world. You know, South Africa, Sweden, New Zealand, writing to me to tell me what the book means to their children.
Wow! So how does someone get to be part of that?
She chooses the books, and she chooses, I think, a short list or a long list, and then people vote over them, and that's, I believe somebody said 250,000 people or something. So whoever's been part of this before.
Fabulous. So look into Read Aloud. Is that what it's called?
The Global Read Aloud.
So look into the Global Read Aloud, especially if you're a kid, teenager, and you just want to connect with people all around the world. What an amazing thing.
Yeah,
and it
goes
only
through
happens because
schools
of the
and
webs,
libraries.
I assume.
Yes.
School libraries.
Schools and libraries, yeah.
Okay, that is really interesting. So tell me about the last book, A Time to Dance.
A Time to Dance is a book that I wrote before The Bridge Home, and it is a novel in verse. So it's a novel that's essentially written in poetry. I always loved poems. Even when I was a little child, my mother says that when I was 4, I already used to dictate poems to her, and apparently I was very picky about my line breaks. And now, I think about them so much, and apparently at that time everything was crystal clear to me as a 4-year-old, and I would dictate them to her. So I think poetry is something that I've carried with me for a long time, and the book is the first novel that is about a young woman's spiritual awakening as its main theme, as seen through the lens of the Hindu religion. And it is about a young girl who wants to dance more than anything in the world, loses her leg, and fights to continue to dance again. But through that, her relationship with everything is deepened.
What has the reaction been to these books from children? They're all so heartfelt, and you put a lot of yourself into them, do you not?
I do. And I think it's been amazing. I mean, with Climbing the Stairs, I had someone walk up to me, and I honestly thought she had mistaken me for some other author, but she said, no, Climbing the Stairs was the book that allowed her to know that she could go to college. And she was a Latina woman. I mean, to me, I remember her face. Just the fact that she said that was incredible to me. I mean, with A Time to Dance, I've had so many people as well walk up to me and tell me how much they loved it and all of that. But with The Bridge Home, I think, to me more than any other book, already I know of 2 women and several children who have moved to safety through the book. Because when the book begins with domestic abuse, which is the reason why 2 sisters run away from home, and the book is written as one sister speaking to another sister, and you don't know why the 2 girls are apart. Yes, and when I had to write that book, I had to revisit some very difficult times in my own childhood when my father could be violent, and there are men in my family who can be violent, and I had to visit that again. And when I speak about the book, I speak about that as well. And I think through the book, just the fact that this book has been responsible for children moving closer to safety, if nothing else happens with the book, that's the most humbling, most wonderful thing.
You said to me that sometimes you feel that your daughter is learning to read these because you don't want her to experience some of the things that are in the novels. But you really have addressed human issues with these books that are so important for kids to think about, because as a child I certainly never did. Or if people did experience some of these things, they kept them to themselves. They never talked about them, but this legitimates the sense of conversation that can happen.
Absolutely, and I don't mean to say that young people cannot read these books. Of course they should.
I said it wrong again, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no. But let me explain. I think the books are, if you read them when you're 10 or above, I think then you can understand more. Mm-hmm. So the Climbing the Stairs is certainly about my mother's childhood and so on, but it's also about the larger question of violence and non-violence, and whether a human being or a nation should ever be violent. And I think you might miss that if you read it too young. Mm-hmm. So I think sometimes there are reasons to hold a book away from a child. And as parents, sometimes we brag. We love to say, oh, my daughter's reading at the 5th grade level when she's only 2 or whatever. And I think maybe she or he can read at that level, but that doesn't mean they should. In part because socially, I think you can understand and appreciate a book so much more. And sometimes children and even adults will say, oh, I read that book 5 years ago. I don't need to read it again. Mm-hmm. And then they may miss something. They may not appreciate it well enough. And I think that's part of the reason that I held her back for a while. But now she can read them. The Bridge Home was written for her.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading them. Let me see this last one, Island's End. I guess you spoke a little bit about that. But this also has an award, National Outreach Council. Is that right?
Oh, no, it actually won the South Asia Book Award.
Oh, wow, that's fabulous.
Yes.
So you are read internationally, is what you're saying?
Yeah, I hope so, yeah.
Your work, both with the oceans and with kids, draws you to help people to look at a new level, a new understanding. How did you gain that? Do you feel that you're doing that? Or
I hope so. I would love to do that. I hope I have many years of life left in me to do that even more. There are disappointments. There always are. There are also wonderful things. I mean, the Bridge Home received 8 starred reviews, which means it got starred reviews separately 8 times, which is amazing and wonderful and a gift. And yeah, I'm very, very grateful for all the wonderful things I've had through my books.
There's a world of young adult writers, isn't there?
Yes.
And you all encourage each other, is that right?
We try to. I hope we do. Your son, Tobin, is certainly, or M.T. Anderson is an amazing writer as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, he's incredible.
I'm going to read another quote from A Time to Dance. I shake my head. It was all me, my mistake. I read too much into everything, dreamed, imagined, and let my thoughts go as out of control as my body. What a great thing to say, that I just couldn't control my imagination and my thoughts. Is that you as a child?
Yes. I think it's also me as an adult. I feel like when I begin to write a book, I always say it's a voice that comes into my head. And after that, it becomes like a movie that's playing in my mind. Mm. But I know I'm getting to the end of the book when I feel like there are ghosts haunting our kitchen table, and my family says, send them away, please. We'd like to have dinner. Because, and then the final stage is when I feel like I can dream as though I am one of the characters. So I'm dreaming a scene from within them. And so if that's not letting my imagination run away with me, I don't know what is.
It's not running away, because you are obviously corralling it wonderfully in these books, and we congratulate you. Thank you so much for being part of Good News Rhode Island, and we wish you all the very best as a young adult writer, and we are thankful for all the people who are reading your books. Thank you for watching Good News Rhode Island. We're sure there's good news near you, and you're helping to make it.